And, I think Dana Bash and Jake Tapper are sort of at the forefront of some of that horrific genocide participation, I would call it, participation in genocide. But so is the New York Times, so is the Wall Street Journal. I could go on and on naming corporate mainstream media outlets that have just consistently lied and spread Israel's genocidal propaganda. So when we talk about holding media accountable, what does that mean, and what is the historical precedence for that?
And thank goodness for alternative media like yours. Thank goodness for social media, because otherwise people would have no idea. This is often described as the first live streamed genocide in history, and that's true. And if it were not being live streamed because of independent media, because of social media, this propaganda effort by Western media and Western politicians would succeed in erasing it. Because if your only source of information is mainstream corporate Western media, you'll have no idea that Israel is on trial for genocide in the world court.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Israel has mowed down international law in Gaza, and it's continuing this pattern in Lebanon as it expands its carpet bombing and is in the process of invading following a series of terrorist attacks. While Palestine is recognized as an occupied territory, Lebanon has the status of a sovereign country. What are Palestine's rights in the face of ongoing genocide? How about Lebanon's rights in the midst of yet another Israeli invasion? What about Syria and Iran, which have also been subjected to Israeli aggression? Israel claims to be massacring civilians in the name of self-defense, with, of course, the full backing of the U.S. Does this have any merit? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by longtime human rights lawyer Craig Mokhiber, who resigned from the UN last year over its failure to address what he called a textbook case of genocide in Gaza. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full episode is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate the show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Craig, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Rania. Happy to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you back on. It's been quite some time. The last time I had you on, you had just recently resigned from your position at the UN. Was it back in October or November that happened?
That was the end of October. Yeah, it's been just about a year.
Okay, so now we're like, wow, and it's still happening, right? Like we talked about the fact that you resigned over what you called a textbook case of genocide, and that textbook case of genocide has continued to unravel, and we've seen it escalate into Lebanon just in the last few weeks in a really significant and horrifying way. So let's start with the issue of Lebanon. The Israelis are laying out the same propaganda, the same narrative about Lebanon in a similar way that they did about Palestine, about Gaza. They're calling this an act of self-defense. And just to walk people through what's happened over the last 2 weeks, because it has been very shocking, and it feels like some things that happened 2 weeks ago happened a year ago because it's been so much. But it started with exploding those pagers and then the walkie-talkies. Then you had that flattening of the building in Dahiyeh, the southern suburb of Beirut that gets pummeled in any Israeli war on Lebanon. And that seems like it was so long ago, because then after that was dropping 85 bombs. Well, no, there was a day of carpet bombing that killed over 500 people. And then there was, days later, last week, Israel dropping 85 bombs to take out 6 residential apartment buildings in Dahiyeh again in their assassination of Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah. Israel says our right to self-defense, our right to self-defense. Hezbollah's been firing at us since October 8th. We have no other option but to, destroy Lebanon and dismantle Hezbollah, basically, with the full backing of the U.S. And of course, the media is going along with it too. Craig, I bumped into someone yesterday. I'm back at my parents in Virginia, and I bumped into someone yesterday who was not really paying attention to the news, but saw that Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah and had no idea that hundreds of civilians had likely been killed in the process of doing that with all those bombs, because the media didn't even mention them. So all that's to say, let's start with Lebanon. Does Lebanon have a right to respond to Israel? What are Lebanon's rights in this situation? It's a sovereign country. It's currently being invaded, and it spent the last 2 weeks being carpet bombed.
Yeah, and that's just the last 2 weeks. I mean, if you zoom back even just this past year, You see that Israel has been engaged in genocide in Palestine. It has attacked Lebanon and Syria and Yemen and Iran and Iraq. In that context, to be constantly claiming self-defense is an absolutely, I think, remarkable statement. And the fact that that is all backed by the United States, by the wider West, and here's my piece, in blatant violation of international law. And we should remember over the objections of the majority of countries and the majority of people around the world, and then to try to put yourself out as the one who is exercising self-defense, I think truly remarkable. And just in the last several days, as you say, hundreds of Lebanese civilians have been killed, thousands wounded, massive destruction, 1 million people displaced in just a matter of days. And now we've got this blatant act of aggression where it's launched at least a partial ground invasion on the sovereign territory of Lebanon, attacking in a very significant way Beirut. And I know just in the last minutes we've seen some retaliatory strikes inside Israel from Iran, but maybe we'll have to wait to see what the news is on this. But you've got Israel's U.S. sponsor and all of America's pawns and acolytes in Europe doing nothing but repeating over and over this approved mantra of Israel has a right to defend itself. But first, Rania, we have to say these attacks on Lebanon have nothing to do with self-defense. In fact, they are about just about everything but self-defense. In the first case, they are literally about defending the right to commit genocide against the Palestinians, because Hezbollah has been very clear that its original attacks on the 8th of October and since then have been about protection for the Palestinians being subjected to genocide in Gaza. Of course, there are other things. None of this is new. Israel has been attacking Lebanon on and off for decades. They have a strategy of periodically weakening Lebanon and, frankly, any other countries in the region to make sure that none ever rise to a level where they are in any way a threat to the hegemony, to the dominance, overall dominance of Israel in the region. They're happy if they can weaken Hezbollah in the process as well. I think it's also about trying to keep the levels of fear of Israel as a regional deterrent permanently on a high level. This is a centerpiece of Israeli policy, is trying to let everyone in the region know that we will blow you up if we in any way feel that you are refusing our edicts or are in any way threatening us. That's a part of the long-term strategy for regional dominance by Israel. And depending on how it goes, and we've heard the statements coming from the crazies in the Israeli government about taking over all or part of Lebanon because of their biblical vision of a greater Israel. But depending on how it goes, it may also be about seizing territory and occupying a part of Lebanon, maybe up to the Litani River and so on, indefinitely if they can get away with it. And I think their biggest wish, and this has to be a part of it, is to try to draw the U.S. into a regional war on Iran, which is their biggest target. And that, if they can get away with that, that'll be a big bonus for them. And of course, everyone also always talks about, and it's true, the personal motivations of Netanyahu, who needs endless war to protect himself from accountability from his own people, not for committing genocide, which they endorse, but for his own personal crimes and his own personal failings as prime minister. But I think, where I started is the main reason. People should remember that Israel is attacking Lebanon in order to defend its right to commit genocide against the Palestinian people. Hezbollah was interfering with that. Of course, Israel always claims self-defense, right? And that's going to be parroted by the Americans and the Europeans and by their like-minded media corporations. But there are a lot of problems with Israel's claim to self-defense. And we can talk about Palestine, but just in the case of Lebanon, right? This claim meets none of the requirements of international law for an assertion of self-defense as codified by the UN Charter. That's the first thing. The second thing is they have a territorial problem, which I will explain. And the third thing is that many of the acts that Israel is committing in the name of self-defense constitute war crimes. And those crimes are not justified in the law by claims of self-defense. So you can debunk these claims, but of course you're not going to hear that in Western media. So first, self-defense is defined under Article 51 of the UN Charter. I won't get too legalistic here, but it only allows for a temporary exception to the prohibition of the use of force. And you have to have certain requirements. There has to be one of necessity, one of proportionality. You have to report to the Security Council. because it's a temporary thing until the Security Council can take up the matter. And there has to be an armed attack first, not just a threat, but an armed attack on your territory. And that means, this idea of necessity, there have to be no other options. Well, there are other options. Israel could stop its genocide. It can enter into negotiations. There are other possibilities here to remove what it sees as a threat. And in any event, it's only temporary until the Security Council takes it up. Israel has not reported to the Security Council according to what is recorded in this case. And the other thing is that what it's doing is not proportional. Right? You're talking about massive destruction. You're talking about terrorist acts like the pagers. You're talking about at least a partial ground invasion at this time. So they don't meet the requirements under international law in this regard. And here's, I think, Rania, one of the most interesting things. They also don't even meet the test of an armed attack against them in the first instance. Let me explain this, right? If you just look back to October 8th. This recent conflict between Hezbollah and Israel started when Israel launched its current round of genocide in Gaza, right, in October. And Hezbollah immediately declared that the reason that it was launching against Israel is that it wanted to stop Israel's attacks against the people in Gaza, right? And what they responded with on October 8th, in defense of the people who were being massacred in Gaza, was attacks not on civilians, right? Hezbollah didn't attack civilians. They attacked Israeli military forces, and not inside Israel, but in the Israeli-occupied Shaba farms in Lebanon, which Syria agrees is a part of Lebanon, and even Israel agrees that it's not theirs, although they claim it's a part of Syria. And your viewers will know that Israel has occupied the Sheba farm since 1967. That occupation is unlawful. It has no sovereignty over that territory. And even Israel admits it's a part of a territory that it captured in 1967 in that case. So these attacks by the Lebanese forces were inside Lebanese territory against Israeli military forces that were unlawfully occupying that territory and in defense of a civilian population being subjected to a genocide. That does not, in my assessment, qualify as an act of aggression by Hezbollah, right? So that's how this current conflict started. So where is Israel's right to self-defense if it wasn't an armed attack under that definition? Attacks on a country's armed forces outside the country can give rise to a claim of self-defense, but not if their presence is illegitimate in the first place. Which I argue it is in the Sheba farms where Hezbollah launched the first attacks, and it attacked military targets, not civilians. So there was nothing criminal or terroristic in those attacks under the laws of war. And of course, Hezbollah went even further, one has to say, to respond to the genocide in Gaza by, throughout this time, carefully limiting and tailoring all of its responses to try to avoid escalation, right, in this back and forth. It even stopped firing altogether during that brief Gaza ceasefire, proving, I think, to everyone that its engagement was about what was happening to the Palestinian people in Gaza. Compare that to Israel, on the other hand, which always wanted escalation, and so it continuously escalated. It responded with disproportionate attacks, not only on military targets, but on civilians as well. And remember, in the back and forth that's been going on during this period, between 70 and 80% of the attacks came from Israel. Only maybe 20% came from Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is still focusing on military targets, while Israel, as always, does not distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. It defines all civilians as either collateral damage or human shields or terrorists, right? So no distinction there. So again, Israel's actions on the ground, not legitimate under international law. I think the other important piece of context is that Israel violates Lebanese sovereignty constantly, has done so for years. Illegal overflights, drones, all of these things that the Lebanese people have become accustomed to. These are violations of Lebanese sovereignty and violations of UN resolutions and so on. Never talked about, by the way, in Western media that always wants to paint the Lebanese as the ones who are in violation here. And then, as you mentioned, and I'll just to say this because it relates to their claim of self-defense, Israel launched a mass terror attack against Lebanon using these unlawful booby traps and pagers and other devices that killed and maimed hundreds of people, including many civilians and and children. And it followed those terror attacks by actions that were designed to deliberately spread terror across the civilian population, which, by the way, is also a war crime. And here I'm talking about immediately as people were trying to recover from the horror of the terror attack with the pagers, and then a second wave with walkie-talkies and other devices, they flew their jets over Beirut, intentionally emitting sonic booms and dropping flares to keep the public terrified after the pager attacks, and then moved into dropping this massive ordinance on densely populated Beirut neighborhoods, implementing its Dahiyya doctrine of widespread civilian destruction. By the way, in the Dahiyya neighborhood again, for which it was named. These are what it's doing in Lebanon can only be read as an extension of its genocidal plans for Palestine. Because the most recent reports that have come out of Israel is that the Israeli leadership decided to assassinate the Hezbollah leader Nasrallah precisely because Hezbollah insisted on an end to the genocide in Gaza, and it would not relinquish that demand. And the Israelis decided that it was so important to continue the genocide in Gaza that they would have to deal with Nasrallah and with Hezbollah. So it is an extension in that sense of the genocide. And that massacre in the southern suburbs of Beirut and the killing of the leadership of Hezbollah was only the beginning. And that's why we see what's going now in southern Lebanon and over Beirut. And I don't think anyone should be surprised. I mean, settler colonialism is by definition and necessarily genocidal. You either kill everyone on the land that you're stealing, or you adopt permanent state of state violence to continue to impose your state by force on the indigenous people. In this case, this is different from some other cases of a settler colonial genocide, because Israel realizes that it not only has to impose itself by force on the nation of Palestine, but it has to impose itself on force in the broader region. And I think what Lebanon is suffering now is the consequences of that. I think that is the bigger picture. And in that picture, the law is not on the side of Israel in claiming self-defense.
I mean, it really is astounding that you have a country that is bombing everyone around it, whether it's Palestinians. And I mean, I'm not saying bombing military installations here even. They're bombing openly bombing civilians, whether we're talking about Lebanon, whether we're talking about various parts of Palestine. We're also talking about Syria. I mean, just yesterday, the Israelis killed like 3 civilians, including a journalist, in an airstrike on Damascus. You also have them bombing Yemen. They bombed the port of Hudaydah like 2 days ago in Yemen, killing and injuring dozens and dozens of people. They have even struck Tehran. And I mean, as just so people know, I mean, this is, by the time this goes up, this will have been old news. And who knows what new shocking event will have taken place. But as we're recording this, Iran reportedly just fired 150 ballistic missiles at Israel. It's unclear where those landed, but there was actual impact. And I do just want to state that the IRGC has said the operation is based on our legal right to self-defense, and that Iran's mission to the United Nations describes the attacks on Israel as a legal, rational, and legitimate response. I mean, we'll have to wait and see what the outcome of that of those missile strikes were. But I think it's interesting here, the fact that Israel, the US, the Europeans are constantly defending Israel's massacres in the context of Israel defending itself, when none of that actually is self-defense. Not only that, but you don't get the right to commit war crimes, even if you are reacting in self-defense. And I do think it's important to turn the tables here, because who's actually being aggressed is the rest of the region, and don't they have a right to self-defense? So you basically laid out Lebanon's right to self-defense. And I also find it really important to emphasize what you said about the fact that Hezbollah intervened against the genocide by hitting a military installation in an area Israel illegally occupies. Not only that, Hezbollah has continued to target military installations, while even before the last 2 weeks, Israel has been not just targeting Hezbollah fighters, but also has targeted journalists, has been using white phosphorus illegally, and has been targeting civilians, not as much as it has upped the ante in the last couple of weeks. And I do just want to ask you real quick before we move on to the issue of Palestine, Craig. I mean, when it comes to the Genocide Convention, it does state that there is a legal obligation to prevent and to punish genocide. So could Hezbollah's response to targeting Israeli military installations not fall under that category?
Well, I mean, I would say in general terms that first, yes, absolutely, there is an obligation under the Genocide Convention to prevent and to punish and to stop genocide. There is an obligation effectively to intervene to stop this crime of all crimes. And no state in the world has met its obligations to do so.
Except for maybe Yemen.
In the case of genocide, I was going to say the only forces that have done so have been Ansar Allah, the Houthi part of Yemen, and Hezbollah. And I mean that is outrageous. And those interventions were sincere. They were genuine attempts to try to resist what was happening against the Palestinian people in Gaza, a genocide. There were important interventions made in other realms, for example, the South African genocide case in the International Court of Justice, some other diplomatic moves and so on. But no force has taken seriously its responsibility to actually intervene to stop Israel's genocide. Nobody has come to the rescue in the strict sense, except for the Houthis and Hezbollah. No question about it. What they're doing is a principle that was touted for decades by the West as humanitarian intervention, which was often used by the West as a Trojan horse for aggression and illegal interventions and regime change, not to improve the human rights situation, but to regain control over the countries that they targeted. And here you have genuine, sincere effort to intervene for humanitarian reasons because a genocide was being perpetrated against the Palestinians, and no one else besides those two forces have made that effort. Now, it wouldn't qualify as the so-called responsibility to protect because it's not approved by the Security Council, which is a requirement. By the way, most of the West efforts would not qualify as responsibility to protect either because they weren't approved in that case. But no doubt, in general terms, in layperson's terms, that's what we have witnessed, right? In those cases, and you know, if you look at, so there's the genocide in Palestine, there's the apartheid in Palestine, there's the aggression by Israel against its neighbors. There are efforts to try to address that in the Security Council, blocked by Israel's allies like the United States in the Security Council.
Yeah.
There are efforts to resolve it diplomatically, interfered with and blocked by Israel's allies around the world. There are efforts to deal with these things peacefully through peaceful demonstrations, brutally put down. The Great March of Return in Gaza, for example, where Israel unleashed its snipers and cut down those Palestinians who are peacefully protesting, the brutal repression of demonstrations around the world, in the capitals around the world by the police in Western capitals. And if you get to that point and you say every effort at peaceful demonstrations, at boycott and divestment and sanctions, which are legally opposed in countries in the West, every peaceful effort to stop war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and gross violations of human rights are met by repression, it is a fair question to ask what is left except armed resistance. It is a very fair question to ask that. And armed resistance is a right under international law for peoples who are subjected to foreign occupation, colonial domination, racist regime, which perfectly describes the situation of the Palestinian people. That is a legitimate right. And in fact, when you get into dialogue where you ask the question, who in the conflict between the Israelis in the occupied territories and the Palestinians in the occupied territories, who has the right to self-defense? Under the law, it is not Israel. It is the Palestinians, absolutely. You know, and without question. And yet, this does not stop Western media and Western politicians from dusting off this old self-defense canard every time. And it's interesting when they do it, every time Israel commits an atrocity, after every successive war crime and crime against humanity, that's when, and somebody will ask one of these spokespersons in the State Department or somebody on a talk show or a Western politician, you know, what about this atrocity that Israel just committed? And the answer always begins with, well, we think Israel has a right to defend itself. And I say, no, it does not. As a matter of international law, I've said that's a double lie. First, Israel has no such right in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights. As a matter of law, it cannot assert self-defense in these territories that it's illegally occupying. And secondly, as we've already said, the acts that it claims self-defense for are not justifiable under self-defense because they are crimes. So, Israel, in its violating the self-determination of the Palestinian people and its duty to respect human rights, the duty to refrain from the use of force, it's in violation of all of those. It exists by virtue of the violation of international law and breach of these principles, right? And as I said before, self-defense, right? That is a claim under Article 51 of the Charter. That is a temporary exception to the prohibition on the use of force for the self-defense from external attacks. Doesn't apply in occupied Palestine.
No, and I think it's really important what you're explaining. And I do want to encourage people. You wrote a piece about this for Mondo Weiss. It's called "No, Israel Does Not Have a Right to Defend Itself in Gaza, but the Palestinians do," essentially breaking down in detail what you just explained. And this speaks to another element of what Israel does in its sort of propaganda campaign. And that is, the fact that we talk about every accusation as a confession, and I'll get to that in a moment. But more than that, it's like everything that Israel carries out in the name of A, B, and C is also projection, right? Because Israel is claiming to do this to defend itself from attempted genocide against Israelis, against Jews, right? When actually it's the one carrying out the genocide. It's doing this to fight Nazis when actually they're the ones behaving like Nazis. And so anyways, that goes to the whole every accusation is a confession. And you wrote a piece on this too. It's titled Every accusation is a confession, Israel and the double lie of human shields. Before we talk about human shields, I want to play a clip because I just can't get over this clip. I will never, ever forget this clip. I will never, ever forgive Dana Bash for this clip. Here's a clip of Dana Bash saying something that I think is really illuminating because it speaks to that accusation being a confession.
I want to ask you about sexual violence. And it's kind of remarkable that this issue hasn't gotten enough attention globally. Widespread use of rape, brutal rape, sexual violence against Israeli women by Hamas. I've seen a lot of progressive women, generally speaking, they're quick to defend women's rights and speak out against using rape as a weapon of war, but downright silent on what we saw on October 7th and what might be happening inside Gaza right now to these hostages. Why is that?
I mean, I don't know that that's true. I think we always talk about the impact of war on women in particular. In fact, I remember 20 years ago, I did a petition around the war in Iraq.
You said,
saying that,
you talked about it since October 7th?
Absolutely. And I've condemned what Hamas has done. I've condemned all of the actions. Absolutely. The rape, of course. But I think we have to remember that Israel is a democracy. That is why they are a strong ally of ours. And if they do not comply with international humanitarian law, they are bringing themselves to a place that makes it much more difficult strategically for them to be able to build the kinds of allies, to keep public opinion with them. And frankly, morally, I think we cannot say that one war crime deserves another. That is not what international humanitarian law says.
Okay, with respect, I was just asking about the women, and you turned it back to Israel. I'm asking you about Hamas. In fact,
I already answered your question, Dana. I said it's horrific, and I think that rape is horrific, sexual assault is horrific. I think that it happens in war situations. Terrorist organizations like Hamas obviously are using these as tools. However, I think we have to be balanced about bringing in the outrages against Palestinians. 15,000 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes, 3/4 of whom are women and children.
And it's horrible, but you don't see Israeli soldiers raping
well, Dana, I think
women.
we're not.
Okay, so that really makes my blood boil because also we now know that rape, those Hamas rapes didn't happen. There's no evidence of them. Moreover, again, every accusation is a confession because we have Israelis on video gang raping Palestinians in the torture dungeons they've created. it got zero attention from Dana Bash, who sat there and said that Israeli soldiers aren't raping Palestinian women. Actually, they are, as a weapon of war. And I mean, that's just not just me saying that. Again, it's on video. And if people don't know what happened, it's because the US media isn't covering it. And we'll get to the media. But to go to the accusation as a confession, I mean, there's the rape accusation that seems to be actually Israel confessing. And then what you specifically wrote about was the human shields accusation. So that's what I want to ask you to talk about, is Israel is also, on top of accusing Palestinians of raping Israelis with no evidence, constantly justifying killing Palestinian civilians by saying they're all human shields for Hamas. They've now extended that logic to Lebanon. In Lebanon, all of us are human shields for Hezbollah, according to the Israelis, so we're all killable. So the crazy part about that is that it's Israel who uses Palestinians as human shields. So I'll let you take it from there.
I mean, first, thanks for subjecting me to Dana Bash again.
Misery needs company, Craig.
I have said that Dana Bash and Jake Tapper and some of these other Western journalists are participating in incitement to genocide. I mean, the direct propaganda, disinformation, dehumanization of the Palestinians, justification for war crimes, in which that they have proactively disseminated over a period of all of these 12 months. This is not just sloppy journalism. They are a part of the mechanism of genocide in Palestine, and they need to be held accountable for that, which is a big challenge. But I mean, we can talk about it if we get into the media. What I think is really important when you hear these lies about human shields, that, by the way, have been investigated and debunked by major international human rights organizations, United Nations investigators, over and over again after every allegation by Israel. You have to think about the intention of the lie. It's not just an innocent representation to make your side look better. When Western politicians and media professionals tell that lie, they are trying to justify war crimes and atrocities. They're participating in the justification of war crimes and atrocities. And when they lie about a mass rape campaign perpetrated on October 7th by Hamas, for which there is no evidence, and that has been investigated over and over again, and they remain silent about the actual systematic rape of Palestinians in Israeli detention, not just over the course of the last year, but going back all the way to the Nakba in 1947, in 1948, they are also perpetrating that in order to create the conditions to allow genocide against the Palestinian people. It is one of the oldest and most common forms of incitement, is to say that these people are raping our women. African Americans have experienced this. People in past genocides have experienced this in places like Rwanda. And this, every accusation is a confession. This is an old tool of incitement for genocide. Genocide scholars have long talked about this thing called accusation in the mirror. It's one of the several indicators of genocide, where you accuse the other side of committing atrocities that you then go and then perpetrate against them. It is a common feature of genocide, and rape allegations are one of the most common ones, because it says we have to get them because they're coming for our women. Mm-hmm. We have to kill them because they're coming to kill us. So Israel is, I started this year by saying what they're doing was a textbook case of genocide. It is literally following the textbook of genocide, collectively written since Raphael Lemkin, coined the term genocide, step by step and claim by claim. And those media personalities and Western politicians who then repeat that, they are also, it seems to me, accountable in part for the crimes that are then perpetrated, or after the fact, the crimes that then get impunity because of these veils of lies that they are actively putting over those crimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important to understand. And I'm curious if you can go into that a little bit, because you did also write about the fact that Western media can be held accountable for its role in the Gaza genocide, and that there is historical precedent for it. And I think Dana Bash and Jake Tapper are sort of at the forefront of some of that horrific genocide participation, I would call it, participation in genocide. But so is the New York Times. So is the Wall Street Journal. I mean, I could go on and on naming corporate mainstream media outlets that have just consistently lied and spread Israel's genocidal propaganda. So when we talk about holding media accountable, what does that mean, and what is the historical precedence for that?
Okay, so and I'm just realizing I didn't answer your question about human shields, but maybe we can go back to it.
Oh, we can go back to it. There's so much, Craig. There's so much. There's just like so much happening all the time. It's so hard to keep up with. Like every day there's some new reality. Like now there's a new reality of like, wow, Iran and Israel are like directly hitting each other, which opens another whole can of worms. Anyways, there's a lot to discuss. So we can go back. We can go back to human shields. What do you want first? Do we want to talk about media, or do we want to talk about human shields?
The media, and if there's time, happy to go back to the human shields.
Okay, perfect. And I think our viewers are totally on board and can relate, because they too, it's like there's like a war on our minds happening. And I'll say that about the media too, it's a war on reality. There's like an information war on our brains. Like it's like you see your screen full of dead children, of maimed children, of amputated babies, like babies. Just yesterday, a woman who we've had on Breakthrough News, Wafa Al-Udaini, was killed. She's a journalist in Gaza, was killed with her 3 children. And that is after surviving almost a year of genocide. And her daughter actually survived initially and had to have her leg amputated. And her last hours were spent in excruciating pain, because she ultimately did die, having had her leg amputated, probably with 0 anesthesia. And this is what's on your screen, right? And then you look at the media and it's telling you that Israel's defending itself from savages or something. And it's just like, it is a war on your brain. So I understand why we're all over the place is what I'm trying to say. But yes, back to the media issue, please.
Well, and thank goodness for alternative media like yours. Thank goodness for social media, because otherwise people would have no idea. This is often described as the first live streamed genocide in history. And that's true. And if it were not being live streamed because of independent media, because of social media, this propaganda effort by Western media and Western politicians would succeed in erasing it. Because if your only source of information is mainstream corporate Western media, you'll have no idea that Israel is on trial for genocide in the World Court. You have no idea that Israel's leaders are the subject of requests for arrest warrants for crimes against humanity. You won't have heard all of these statements of genocidal intent by the president, the prime minister, the cabinet ministers, military commanders of Israel. You will still believe the false stories of beheaded Israeli babies, long proven to be fabricated, and you'll be unaware of the fact that many Palestinian babies have in fact been beheaded by the Israelis. You won't know about the systematic killing of civilians, of children, of infants, of women, vulnerable people of all kinds. You won't know about the torture camps that Israel has established. As we said, the systematic rape of detainees, Israeli snipers targeting small children over and over again, right? And you won't know that Israel, I wrote that you won't know that Israel now holds the world's records for the murder of journalists, the murder of aid workers, the killing of UN officials, the killing of healthcare workers, right? Instead, what you would know is this false Israeli disinformation and propaganda that is just repeatedly disseminated in Western media for the purpose of of justifying war crimes and dehumanizing the Palestinians, distracting the public away from the atrocities and so on. There is this disconnect. On the one hand, there's the reality on the ground that we know about. But if you read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or watch CNN or Fox or ABC or CBC, CBS or NBC or the BBC, you're going to get a completely different story. And that's why, Rania, what I've said is that there are 3 pillars to the genocide that's happening in Palestine. One of them is the Israeli genocide machine in Palestine. One of them is the US, the UK, Germany, and other Western governments that are sponsoring, paying for, arming, and providing diplomatic cover for the genocide. But an essential 3rd pillar is the role of this complicit Western media corporations that are doing what's necessary to sustain the genocide, and doing it knowingly, since we're talking about this as a crime.
And what's that? And is there a historical precedence for going after media? in terms of genocide.
So first of all, in international law, international human rights law, the Genocide Convention, and the Genocide Convention, incitement to genocide and complicity in genocide are separate crimes, right? There's committing genocide, but incitement and complicity are also crimes, right? And those crimes can apply not only to states, but to private actors as well, like corporate media actors and news stations. And when these laws were being drafted in the 1940s, they were well aware of the fact that the Nuremberg Tribunal, after the Second World War, actually convicted a guy called Julius Streicher for incitement and persecution on racial grounds, because he had this publication called Der Stürmer, right? A German Nazi publication that engaged in incitement to murder and extermination, even while Der Stürmer and Streicher knew what was happening to European Jews at the hands of the Nazi Germanies. And so he was actually convicted and hanged. And then 50 years later, after the genocide in Rwanda, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda convicted 3 different media actors for their role in inciting the Rwanda genocide. 2 worked for this infamous television and radio company called Mille Collines, and another one for the Kangura newspaper. And all 3 of them were found guilty of incitement to genocide and other crimes. And that these are recent precedents. And if one of the things that the judges in those cases emphasized was that they knew what they were doing, right? They knew what was happening on the ground. They knew what they were doing to encourage it and to obscure the truth in the process. And I have said in this article that CNN and Fox and BBC and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, they all know what they're doing as well, right? Because if this, as you say, this is the first live stream genocide, and it's happening on the screens of people all over the world. We all can see what's happening. It's not credible to suggest that these Western media companies are not aware of the realities on the ground, and they're not aware of what they're doing to obscure them. They know perfectly well what they're doing. They have made a conscious choice to hide the genocide from their audiences, to dehumanize systematically Palestinian victims, and to try to immunize Israeli perpetrators from accountability. And if they continue to do this even after the International Court of Justice, the World Court, said that charges of genocide are plausible. And even after it issued a series of provisional measures for Israel to stop genocidal actions. And even after the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court requested arrest warrants for crimes against humanity against Israel's leaders, these media companies continued to suppress information and to disseminate propaganda for the genocide. And, you could say that this is just, we're not in Israel or Palestine. So this is just the Western media being irresponsible. But there is a direct nexus between what these companies are doing and saying on the one hand and harms against Palestinians on the ground on the other, because the audiences to which they are broadcasting in places like the United States doesn't just include uninvolved bystanders. It includes Western government officials and policymakers who are directly complicit in the genocide because they're providing military support, economic support, intelligence, diplomatic cover, and so on, and the voting public that enables that support. So their audience to whom they are feeding this propaganda and incitement are actually involved in the harmful acts on the ground. And it also includes very directly a significant number of dual Israeli nationals who live in the United States, consume Western media or the UK or Germany or whatever, and then shuttle back and forth to Palestine to participate in the killing.
It's amazing.
There is a direct nexus. There is intent. There is a direct nexus between what the media companies are doing and the harms that are being caused on the ground. And we are dealing with something which is not just an editorial opinion of unethical journalism, but a crime that's codified in international law and for which there are precedents for prosecution.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And I think that we're going to get to a reckoning one day because this is all documented, right? Like it's in front of our faces. We have hours and hours of 24/7 like CNN footage of all, and all the New York Times articles and the BBC, and it's all there. It's all there to be studied and to fill the pages of, the South African legal team's dossier, or whoever decides to take up that cause at some future date. In the meantime, of course, we still have to contend with the reality that the biggest empire in the history of the world, the United States, is continuing to support Israel's genocide in Gaza with seemingly no end in sight. And to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, the every accusation is a confession, I want to give you the opportunity to sort of dissect the human shield argument. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.